Okay, so today we're just talking about some mature, high school appropriate means for beginning your research papers. So first of all, let's start by talking about what's not effective. It would not be effective, and people always do this, to use first and second person pronouns. You want to avoid those like the plague, because they are informal. Another common fallback for a hook is, did you know, blah, 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 which first of all, that uses a second person pronoun, but also it's so overused that it's very ineffective. Anything that you're just like, yeah, I'll use that because I don't know what else to do, will probably be boring. And going with the first option that pops in your head is not a good idea. People who write for a living go through many different drafts before they choose which hook would be the most effective. So our first technique for a hook would be an anecdote or a story. So you can tell a short story that relates to your topic, and while it's tempting to use I for personal stories, make sure that you avoid doing so. If it is a personal story you're telling, then you need to tell it from the third person point of view. So here's an example of the anecdote. It seemed that all they did was drive, and each time they stopped, it was to visit another site. That morning in Washington, D.C. was different. They stepped out of their hotel and walked 4 or 5 blocks. Suddenly, she was amazed by all that surrounded her. The Capitol building off in the distance, the White House to the left, a vast field of grass, and 2 ponds reflecting a towering white monument. "What's that?" she asked her dad, and he responded, "That's the mountain of George Washington." Monument of George Washington. Her mind started to wonder. A monument? A city named in his honor? This must be someone who made a difference. So this would be like the longest that you would want your anecdote to last, because you definitely don't want your introduction to extend past the 3/4 page mark on the first page of your essay. Okay, technique 2. You can ask 3 questions. So while 1 question alone is usually pretty boring and overdone, 3 questions are more effective and create more of an impact. Make sure the questions clearly relate and build on one another. They can't just be like random questions about the topic that pop in your head. And also make sure to avoid using the word you when you're presenting questions to the reader. So here's an example of how you might use 3 questions as a hook. Is it true that bigger is always better? Could it be that society's insatiable desire for more is in many ways giving people less? Once society has accepted the premise that more is better, is it possible to reverse that trend? For small, local, family-owned businesses, more and bigger has been anything but better. And then this could lead into your bridge. Here's another 3 questions example. How could a book now acknowledged as a masterpiece, not only of fiction, but also of English prose, have been banned when it was published? How could a novel that dealt with love and art be thought of as pornographic? Why would a society so mindful of free speech as America ban any book in the first place? Okay, so technique 3, you could use a quotation, song lyric, or poem. It's best to find famous quotes from well-known sources. If you're going to do this, I wouldn't recommend using a fact from one of your own sources. You're going to need those later in the paper, and they generally don't pack as much of a punch. Use any interesting direct quote. Famous ones tend to be more effective on readers for the establishment of ethos, which is your credibility, remember. Direct quotes can come from songs, poems, literature, speeches, plays, the Bible, and etc. So remember, you can pull from virtually any type of source. And also remember that quoting from a famous poet like Shakespeare or Homer is going to be more impressive than quoting from somebody obscure that the majority of people have never heard from. And there's also no fault in quoting a modern artist either. Okay, here's an example of a quotation. As a leading feminist of the time period, Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Rodham Clinton once voiced, "There cannot be true democracy unless women's voices are heard." Okay, so remember, anytime you are citing a direct quote of any sort, you have to have a signal phrase and an in-text citation. A lot of people like to do just the direct quote and then a dash and the person's name who said it, but that's not acceptable for a formal paper. Okay, fourth technique. You can use an unusual or bizarre fact. The fact or statistic would have to relate to the topic that you're discussing, obviously. It could be a modern-day fact or statistic or an interesting one from a famous time period. Think about like the Civil War, the Renaissance, the Great Depression, the list goes on. So here's an example. Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, could spend $1 million per day every day, 7 days a week, and would not run out of money until he was 311 years old. Most people would agree that he has reached a point of financial security. So obviously this unusual or bizarre fact needs to relate to the topic that you are talking about. And so if it's not at first evident how it relates, then you would want to use your bridge to connect that hook to your topic. Okay, technique 5. Use relevant background information. Now, this is also what you would put in your bridge. So you could do this if you had a lot of background information that you couldn't just fit in a couple sentences, and so you wanted to also encompass your attention getter. Or if your background information is really, really interesting and it would make a good hook, then this would be an appropriate method for you. So background material should be presented concisely and relate to your thesis, and it should be very engaging if you're using it as the hook. So here's an example. Although he was born in Russia and lived for many years in England, Germany, and France before coming to America in 1941, Vladimir Nabokov is now considered one of the great American novelists of the 20th century. This opinion, however, is not based solely on his mastery of English prose. His novel Lolita has been said to have captured the essence of American life in the 1950s better than any novel written by a writer born in this country. Okay, so whether or not this particular background information is exciting to you kind of depends on what you're interested in reading about. People who are literature connoisseurs or classic novel buffs would appreciate this background information. But again, always think about your audience and what they are going to find interesting. Okay, number 6, technique 6. You could do the long-term effect technique. So you could begin by stating a long-term effect of a controversy without immediately stating the cause, which then makes readers want to read more to find out what the cause might be. So you're sort of teasing the readers. So here's an example. It caused howls of protest from the guardians of public morality in the 1950s. Indirectly, it helped bring about both artistic and personal freedom in the 1960s. Today, it is a recognized classic of art and thought. Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. So the fact that we're talking about the novel Lolita comes last, and the build-up to it comes first, and that's what makes for an effective attention getter. Okay, technique 7 is an analogy. You could start by making a comparison between two things. So think about using a simile, sorry, not a similar, using a simile or a metaphor. Literary devices of any kind can be extremely effective attention getters. Just remember, this is a formal academic research paper. It's not creative writing. So while it is perfectly fine to use a literary device, you have to do so in a professional way. So here's an example. Like a hurricane that brings fear and panic along with its powerful winds, uprooting trees and disrupting belief in an all-merciful God, so the novel Lolita swept across America in the 1950s, bringing fear and panic that pedophilia would be loosed on the land. Instead, the novel, like a hurricane, blew over trees of thought that were not deeply rooted in American experience, exposing their gnarled premises while helping to clear the way for the artistic freedom from the 1960s. Okay, so that's written at a very high level, but it's a combination of simile and a metaphor there. And so that would be a good example too, if you could think about your topic and if there's any similes or metaphors that are interesting that you could compare it to, that would be a good way to lead into your paper. Okay, technique 8. You could use a definition. However, not just any definition. So you can begin with a definition of a term that's important to your essay. Please avoid simple dictionary definitions, as those are not interesting. You want to create an expanded definition that explains how the term applies to your topic and essay. So from one of the sources that I consulted for this presentation, which you can find at the end of the slides, there's another example because the source was using this novel Lolita specifically. So just pretend you're thinking about your topic and how it's controversial and what definitions might need to be explained for your audience. Every few years, the ugly charge of pornography is aimed at some novel or movie. Never was the term more inappropriately used than in the case of Lolita, yet the taint of that word still lingers in the minds of many when they hear the book's title. What exactly is pornography, that it should stir such feelings and be so hated? The problem, of course, is that no one can agree upon a solid definition. That it has something to do with physical intimacy seems clear. Beyond that, there's chaos of opinion. And so this is a really interesting way to start. There is no definition here because we're talking about content that isn't necessarily appropriate for school, pornography. But if you were writing this at the college level, it would be okay to then go on and let's say there was somebody famous in the field who had an opinion about the definition of the term. You could then cite their definition. But after doing an interesting hook like this, you would not want to then just revert to the dictionary definition of the word. Now, throughout your essay, it's okay to use dictionary definitions, but it's not okay for the hook of the essay. Okay, so technique number 9, you can use allusions, and you can use them through a framing device too. You don't have to, but it's a lot of English teachers like it when you frame your essay. Framing means to begin your essay and end your essay by referring to the same idea. Like a picture in a frame, your essay would be neatly framed inside the hook and the clincher. So basically, when you're framing, you're starting one way, and then you refer back to that same thing at the end of the essay to frame your body. So allusions are one popular way to accomplish framing. So here's an example. Let's pretend that we are writing about obesity and the struggle that teenagers have with it. So we are going to start with an allusion to Snow White. So our hook might be, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? For many teens, the word fairest all too quickly becomes fattest in their minds. Some have difficulty thinking of themselves as beautiful as they stand before these cruel mirrors. Then you could lead into your bridge where you explain the controversy and the background information about the childhood obesity epidemic. And then you have your body. And then you come back to this at the very end with your conclusion. Remember, the last thought of your conclusion is called the clincher. After revealing the common weight struggle for many teens as well as actions that could be taken to combat the problem, the paper could end with a new, more uplifting version of the mirror question. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the healthiest of them all? So you are reflecting back upon the way you started the essay, and in that way you're framing it. It's also an allusion because everyone would recognize that famous quote from Snow White. Okay, so technique 10, you can use paradoxes. These can be really effective, but you don't have to write your own paradox. You can if you feel confident doing so, but there's a lot of paradoxes that famous authors have already written that would not only give you a little bit of ethos by quoting them, but also could possibly relate to your topic. So here's just a handful of them. What a pity that youth must be wasted on the young. I can resist anything but temptation. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that's Charles Dickens. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. I must be cruel to be kind. The earth that's nature's mother is her tomb. A rich man is no richer than a poor man. Whatever you do will be insignificant, but it is very important that you do it. Life is a preparation for the future. The best preparation for the future is to live as if there were none. And I know one thing, that I know nothing. Okay, so These are all famous paradoxes. You could use them, but remember, you wouldn't want to type them in your essay in this format with the dash and then like Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. You would want to have it in a quote, and you would want to have a signal phrase and an in-text citation stating where you found that paradox. So remember, it takes patience and trial and error to find the best hook for the content of your essay. You have to be willing to spend the time and energy to find the perfect beginning. Whatever you choose to use, you need to be able to smoothly transition from your hook to your bridge, and you must cite any quotes or ideas that are not from your own head, but the hook does not count as a required source. Okay, so this is unacceptable, remember. This is my quote, dash, Mrs. Cruz. This is what we're going for. As a wise English teacher once stated, this is my quote, with the in-text citation. Okay, so there are other examples on your notes. I'm going to switch over really quickly and go through some of those with you. And then once we're done reading through the extra examples, I want you to complete the reflection activity at the end of your notes. Okay, so just some other options that you can use for your hook. If you find you have used a question, change it into a declarative structure. So this would be bad. Have you ever thought that dogs' tails are really neckties for their butts? Remember, we want to avoid just like one single question because they are overused. So more effective would be, most people have probably never considered that dogs' tails are really neckties for their butts. Also, you could try to horrify your audience in a professional manner. So imagine a line of dead and mangled bodies stretching for 25 miles, 25,000 corpses. That is the number of victims of drunk driving every year. It's hard to believe that the number is increasing in spite of the ads and community awareness efforts. The time has come to take more specific measures to get drunk drivers off the road. You could start with a direct quotation from a recognized authority, a famous person, or a literary selection, which again would lend ethos and credibility to your argument. So, authority. Drinking kills more young drivers than any other cause, says John Smith, head of Wisconsin Highway Safety. Their corpses litter the highways of America every night. Sadly, many think that there's nothing they can do about this except have their own designated driver or take friends and family members' keys away. However, studies have shown that cell phones save more people from drunken driving than most people would imagine. Okay, a literary work example. Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet. Along came a spider. She was lucky it wasn't a brown recluse spider. Now found as far north as Wisconsin, this spider sports a nasty bite that, unless treated correctly, can cause death. It's easy to avoid being bitten by following these steps. So obviously that one is for like a essay that would give you directions, instructional essay, which we're not writing, but the concept is still one you could use for your hook. I never forget a face, but in your case, I'll make an exception. Groucho Marx was a master of insults that most found hilarious, as long as the jibes were not directed at them. Applying makeup correctly every day can keep the Grouchos away. Okay, so those are just some fun ways to start an essay. You can also start with a verbal picture that relates to the topic. Try not to use picture this or imagine this, because that takes the fun out of it. The young driver turns up the stereo louder and smiles as he dreams of the fun he had at the party. Plenty of good music and beer. Suddenly, a tree appears from out of nowhere. He grabs at the wheel to turn the car. Headlights swerve in the darkness. It's too late. A patrol car screams to find the twisted body of another kid who drank and drove. Teenagers need to understand the effects of alcohol on their adolescent bodies. You could also start with a contrast. A third-grade class gallops through a daisy-filled meadow with butterfly nets. A ninth-grade Latin class floods the zoo for a lesson in scientific names. High school seniors ride the Demon at Great America for physics class. A field trip may look like time set aside for fun and games, and most students prefer them to regular classes, but serious examination will show that they educate in a way textbooks and lectures never can. So that one's really interesting, too, because that sounds like it could be an argumentative topic. Another anecdote example that I thought was effective. Quincy LaRue had disappeared from school. That night, the custodian heard a frantic rapping and muffled yelling. He opened the locker to find Quincy pale, emaciated, and generally annoyed. His parents were at first relieved and then upset at what happened. While looking frantically for an important math assignment, Quince had fallen headfirst into the messy locker, passing out as he hit his head on the hooks, and an unsuspecting passerby slammed the door shut. Surprisingly, incidents like this are common. Thousands of high school students' lockers are disasters. Okay, so remember I told you can use similes, metaphors, paradoxes. You can use other figures of speech too, like puns. Loretta had been working as a tattoo artist assistant for only 2 weeks, and already he had designs on her. She had no choice, though, to put up with it, because a job's a job. Or is it? Some jobs require employees to do tasks that are fit only for Satan. Or then you have a hyperbole. The sixth great glacial age descended on the United States last year. Though it rapidly left most other regions, the minds of the students at Harbor High have been frozen solid ever since. I think that one's really clever, too. So then you have the same topic and then different lead options for that topic. I'll let you guys read through that one about the hot dogs. Those are clever. And then you have also example of the good and the boring. So interesting. With a thunderous roar, a rocket rises into the dark, carrying a message from Earth to some form of intelligent life out in the vast cosmos. A waste of effort? Perhaps, but it stirs the blood to think that we may not be alone. Okay, and this would be a boring version, so you wouldn't want to do something like this. For centuries, people have wondered about life on other planets. So you can see the difference between a well-written hook and a boring one about the same topic. So now I just want you to take time and reflect. Pick 3 of the hooks that we talked about, either in the other options or on the PowerPoint part of this presentation, and then I want you to write a rough draft of your hook. So like actually try to write the first few sentences of your introduction paragraph right now and bring those to class.